Marcus Doyle had exactly 4 minutes left at Camden Steel before his badge would stop working forever. And he spent every one of them staring at a termination letter that spelled his name wrong. 22 years. 22 years of double shifts, of climbing into machines other men were afraid to touch, of teaching every green kid on that floor how not to lose a finger. And the letter in front of him read Marcus Doyle, like a stranger had written the end of his life and hadn't even bothered to check the spelling. His hands, scarred and steady from 2 decades of factory work, did not shake. But something in his chest did. Because tomorrow was the day his daughter's tuition deposit was due. And today, apparently, was the day the company decided he was disposable. "I'm sorry, Marcus," said Diane from HR, not quite meeting his eyes. "It's not personal. It's restructuring. Corporate is sending someone to finalize everything today." Marcus nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's already decided not to let anyone see him break. 22 years, he said quietly. "Guess that's what restructuring sounds like." Outside the little glass office, the floor kept roaring the way factory floors always do, indifferent to the small tragedies happening inside. Marcus thought of Emily, 17 years old, valedictorian material, the spitting image of her mother, who had passed 4 years ago and left behind a stack of medical bills. Marcus was still quietly paying off one overtime shift at a time. He thought of the acceptance letter taped to their refrigerator. He thought of the word deposit and the number beside it, and for one terrible second, the room tilted. That was the moment the door opened. If you're watching this from somewhere warm tonight or somewhere cold, somewhere close to home or somewhere far from it, type it in the comments right now. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if stories like this one mean something to you, hit that subscribe button before we go any further, because what happens next is going to stay with you. The woman who walked in wore a charcoal blazer that looked like it cost more than Marcus made in a month. Heels that clicked with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted she belonged in a room. This was Vanessa Cole, 36 years old, the new regional operations director sent in from corporate to optimize efficiency across 4 struggling plants. A phrase that, on the factory floor, everyone had already translated into a simpler word: layoffs. She was good at her job, ruthlessly good. In 11 months she'd shut down 2 facilities and never lost a night of sleep over it, or so the rumor went. She didn't apologize for numbers. She didn't soften bad news. People who worked under her said she looked at a spreadsheet the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, clinically, without sentiment, searching only for what needed to be cut. She sat down across from Marcus, opened a folder, and said, without looking up, "Mr. Doyle, I understand HR has already walked you through the terms of your separation. I understand what a pink slip looks like, ma'am," Marcus said, quiet but not unkind. "Wasn't expecting a personal visit for it, though. I like to close out difficult conversations myself," Vanessa said. "It's more respectful than a form letter." She finally lifted her eyes to look at him, and she stopped. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. Just a small pause, the kind you'd miss if you blinked. Her gaze moved from his eyes, to the faint scar along his jaw, to the way his left hand rested flat on the table like he was bracing it against something. Marcus noticed her go still. He'd seen a lot of expressions cross a boss's face right before they fired him. Irritation, boredom, discomfort. But he had never once seen what he saw now. Recognition. "Ma'am?" he said. Vanessa didn't answer right away. Her pen had stopped moving. Something in her had gone somewhere else entirely. 12 years and 400 miles away, to a gas station parking lot in the middle of a January storm, to a girl who had nothing left but a duffel bag and a decision she was 3 minutes from making that she could never take back. "Your name," she said slowly, "is Marcus Doyle." "Yes, ma'am." "Did you?" She stopped herself, cleared her throat, tried again with the careful voice of someone testing ice before stepping onto it. "Did you used to work nights at a Union 76, station off Route 9, outside of Danville?" The floor noise seemed to fade. Marcus's brow furrowed, and for a moment the exhaustion in his face gave way to something else. The effort of dragging up a memory buried under 20 years of double shifts and grief and quietly surviving. "A long time ago," he said, "before I came to Camden." "Why do you?" "Because I was 17, Vanessa said, and her voice cracked in a way that no one at Camden Steel had ever heard it crack. "And you gave a runaway girl your coat in a snowstorm and didn't ask her a single question." The room went silent in the way rooms only go silent right before something in a person's life changes forever. Marcus stared at her. 22 years of memories rearranged themselves in half a second, and somewhere underneath the exhausted maintenance man in the folding chair, a much younger version of him surfaced. a 24-year-old gas station clerk working nights to save for a wedding, who had once found a teenage girl sitting on the curb outside his station at 11 at night in a storm that dropped the temperature into the single digits. No coat, no shoes that fit, no story she was willing to tell. "You had a duffel bag," he said slowly, like he was reading it off some old, dusty page inside himself. "Wouldn't say where you were headed. Kept looking at the highway like you were deciding something." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "I was deciding something." Nobody in that office moved for a long moment. Not Diane, who had gone very still by the filing cabinet. Not Marcus, whose termination letter sat forgotten on the table between them. Not Vanessa, who had spent 17 years building an entire identity out of never needing anyone's help again, and who was now looking at the one person who had ever quietly, wordlessly, refused to let her go through with the worst decision of her life. But to understand why that night mattered so much, why a gas station clerk's coat could reach across 12 years and land in a corporate boardroom, you have to go back to who Marcus Doyle was before any of this. Because kindness like his doesn't appear out of nowhere. It gets built, one sacrifice at a time, usually when nobody's watching. Marcus grew up the kind of poor that teaches a person early that nothing is owed to them. His father worked construction until his knees gave out. His mother cleaned office buildings at 4 in the morning. Marcus learned to fix things because broken things were the only things his family could afford. A car with a failing transmission, a water heater held together with tape and stubbornness, a life that required constant, quiet repair. By the time he was 20, he could fix almost anything except the ache of watching his parents grow old before their time from working too hard for too little. He met Sarah at 22, at a diner where she waitressed double shifts to pay her own way through nursing school. She had a laugh that made strangers turn around, and a habit of giving her tip money to whichever coworker needed it more that week. Marcus used to tease her about it. She used to tell him that was rich, coming from the man who fixed his neighbors' cars for free and told them it was already broken when I got it, so they wouldn't feel bad about not paying him. They married young, saved slowly, and Marcus took the night shift at the Union 76 station to bring in extra money while Sarah finished school. It was there, on a January night when the wind chill dropped below zero and the highway was a ribbon of black ice, that he found a girl sitting on the curb who would not give her name. She'd told him to leave her alone. He didn't. He'd asked her if she was hungry, and when she didn't answer, he brought her a cup of coffee anyway and set it down beside her without a word, then went back inside and let her decide what to do with it. An hour later, she was still there, and so was he, standing just inside the doorway where the heat lamp reached the pavement, not saying anything, just making sure she wasn't alone in the cold. When she finally spoke, it wasn't her name. It was, "Why do you care?" And Marcus, 24 years old, engaged to be married, with $61 in his wallet that was supposed to go toward a wedding ring, said the only thing he knew to be true. Because nobody ever has to be invisible if somebody decides to see them. He gave her his coat. He gave her the $61, folded into her palm before she could argue, and told her there was a shelter 2 miles down Route 9 that took kids no questions asked, and that he'd drive her there himself if she'd let him. She didn't tell him her name until they reached the parking lot of that shelter, and even then it was just Vanessa, nothing more. He never asked why she was running. He never told anyone what he'd done. He went back to his shift, worked the rest of the night in shirt sleeves in the freezing cold, and told Sarah the next morning only that he'd helped somebody out. He never mentioned the coat. He never mentioned the money. That was who Marcus Doyle was. A man who gave away what he could not spare and called it nothing at all. "I need you to know something," she said. "I didn't come here today to fire you specifically. I came here because corporate gave me a mandate to cut 12% of plant staffing across 4 facilities by end of quarter. And your name was on a list generated by an algorithm that has never once met you." Her voice hardened, but not toward him, toward herself. "I've spent 3 years telling myself that's just the job, that the algorithm doesn't lie, that sentiment has no place in operations, that I don't owe anyone anything I wasn't given myself. And now I'm looking at the reason I'm even alive to have this job. If the story has done anything to your heart in the last few minutes, this is the moment to let us know. Type in the comments how it's making you feel right now. And if you believe kindness like Marcus's deserves to be remembered, hit that like button before the story keeps going, because it's about to get a lot harder before it gets better. Here is the thing about Marcus Doyle that even Vanessa didn't fully understand yet. The coat in the snowstorm wasn't a one-time act of grace from a younger, more idealistic man. It was simply how he lived. And nobody at Camden Steel knew that better than Danny Reyes, 23 years old, a forklift operator 2 years into the job, who had been the first person Marcus taught how to run the floor safely, and who, 3 weeks before Marcus's own termination letter arrived, had come to him white-faced and shaking after a phone call from his mother's hospital. "They're saying it's an emergency surgery," Danny had told him in the break room, staring at his phone like it might change what it said. "Insurance won't cover it till open enrollment. They want $4,000 up front or they push the surgery back 2 weeks, and the doctor said 2 weeks might be." He couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus had said only one thing: "How do I wire it?" Danny had refused, obviously, the way anyone with dignity refuses. "I can't ask you for that, Marcus. You've got Emily's tuition coming up. I heard you talking about it." "You didn't ask," Marcus said. "I offered. There's a difference." That night, Marcus went home and pulled up the account where he'd been slowly building Emily's tuition cushion. 3 years of overtime, of skipped vacations, of driving a truck with 190,000 miles on it because a new one wasn't in the budget. And he wired $4,000 to a hospital he'd never see the inside of, for a woman he'd never met because her son was the kind of young man worth investing in. He told Danny it was a loan. He told himself it wasn't, not really, because he had no intention of ever asking for it back. He didn't tell Emily. He didn't tell anyone. It cost him almost every dollar of the cushion meant to secure her future, and he told himself he'd rebuild it with enough overtime before the deposit came due. He was 3 weeks short when the layoff list came out. That is the quiet arithmetic of a man like Marcus Doyle. Kindness given first, consequences absorbed later, and never once a ledger kept of what was owed to him. It is also, as Vanessa was about to discover, the exact reason an algorithm built to measure efficiency had flagged him at all. Marcus had been quietly working extra shifts to cover payroll gaps for younger employees taking family leave, without ever filing overtime for himself, which made his hours-to-output ratio look, on paper, like underperformance. The system had punished him for the very generosity that made him irreplaceable. Vanessa learned all of this over the following 2 days, because once she started pulling the thread of who Marcus Doyle actually was on that factory floor, she couldn't stop. She interviewed supervisors who had no idea she was the one who'd approved his firing. She heard about the $4,000 from Danny himself, who broke down crying in the middle of it and said, "If you cut him loose, you're not just firing a man, you're cutting off the only person keeping half this floor standing." She sat with that late into the night in a hotel room 3 miles from the plant, staring at a printout of the layoff list with Marcus Doyle's misspelled name on it, and she thought about the version of herself sitting on a curb 12 years ago, deciding whether the world had anything left to offer her. She thought about the $61. She thought about the promotion she'd get if she hit her 12% target on schedule, and the reputation she'd damage across corporate leadership if she didn't. And she thought about a coat, still folded somewhere in a box in her mother's old house, that she had never been able to bring herself to throw away. By morning, she had made a decision that terrified her more than any boardroom ever had. She called an emergency meeting with regional leadership, the same executives who had built the 12% mandate, and instead of presenting her finalized layoff numbers, she presented something else entirely. A restructuring plan that cut administrative overhead and consultant contracts instead of frontline labor, a plan that would hit her own numbers just as hard but would cost her personally instead of costing the people on the floor. It meant putting her name on a proposal that could get her fired for insubordination. It meant risking everything she had built since that January night to protect a man who had once given away everything he had for a stranger. "This isn't the plan corporate approved," said the regional VP on the call, his voice flat with warning. "You're supposed to be delivering 12% in labor reduction, not restructuring consultant spend." "I'm delivering 12% in cost reduction," Vanessa said, steady despite the tremor she was fighting to hide. "I'm simply choosing which 12% actually makes this company function. You can fire the people who run these machines, or you can fire the 4 consulting contracts that haven't produced a single measurable result in 18 months. I know which 12% I'd bet the company's future on." The silence on the other end of that call stretched long enough that Vanessa genuinely believed she'd just ended her career. "You have 1 week to make the new numbers work," the VP finally said. "If they don't, this falls on you." "They'll work," Vanessa said, and for the first time since she'd walked into that little glass office and seen Marcus Doyle's face, she felt something close to peace. But peace, in a story like this, never comes without one more test. Because 2 days later, before Vanessa could finalize the reversal, before Marcus had any idea his job had been saved, Emily Doyle came home from school in tears with an email from her university financial aid office. The tuition deposit deadline had not been extended, and without $4,000 by Friday, her spot in the incoming class would be forfeited to someone on the waitlist. Marcus, jobless on paper for 4 more days, with his savings gutted by a decision he would never regret, sat at his kitchen table that night and did the math over and over, hoping it would somehow come out different. It never did. He had given away exactly the amount of money his daughter now needed, to save a young man's mother he barely knew, and he did not have $4,000 left in this world. "Dad?" Emily said quietly, sitting across from him with red eyes. "Did something happen with the money?" Marcus looked at his daughter, 17 years old, brilliant, kind in the exact same quiet way her mother had been, about to lose the one thing she had worked her entire life for, and he had to decide in that moment whether he regretted the choice that put them here. "I gave it to someone who needed it more," he said honestly. "I thought I had time to build it back. I was wrong about the timing. I wasn't wrong about the choice." Emily didn't answer right away. Then she reached across the table and took his scarred, steady hand in both of hers. "Good," she said, voice shaking. "Don't ever be sorry for that. We'll figure out the rest." If you've made it this far, you already know this story is about to ask you the hardest question it has. What happens when doing the right thing costs you everything, right when you need it back the most? Subscribe now if stories like this, stories about ordinary people choosing kindness even when it costs them everything, are the kind you want more of, because what happens in the next few minutes changes every life in this story. Vanessa found out about the tuition deadline the next morning from Danny, who had heard it from a mutual friend at the plant and mentioned it in passing without realizing what he was handing her. She sat perfectly still at her desk for a long moment, and then she did something she had not done in over a decade. She picked up the phone and called her own mother, the one relationship she had spent 12 years slowly, painfully rebuilding since that January night, and she said only, "I need to ask you something about a box in the hallway closet." That afternoon, Vanessa Cole walked back onto the Camden steel floor, past machines that had run for 3 generations of workers, past men and women who had spent the last week bracing for pink slips, and found Marcus exactly where he always was. Fixing something nobody else wanted to touch, a hydraulic press that had been down for 2 days, sleeves rolled up, grease on his forearms, working like a man who still had a job to protect, because that was simply who he was, offer or no offer, paycheck or none. "Mr. Doyle," she said, "I owe you a conversation, and I owe you a great deal more than that." Marcus set down his wrench. "Ma'am, if this is about the severance paperwork, Diane already—" "There is no severance paperwork," Vanessa said. "There is no termination. You're not on the layoff list anymore. You were never supposed to be. I'm sorry it took me this long to fix that." Marcus stared at her, waiting for the part where it made sense. "I don't understand." "I restructured the entire cost plan," she said. "Every position on that original list is safe. All of them, not just yours. I cut consulting contracts corporate has been protecting for years because nobody wanted to have the hard conversation. I had the hard conversation instead." She paused, and her composure, so carefully built over a decade, wavered for just a moment. "It cost me almost everything with the board. I don't regret a single part of it." Marcus's throat tightened. "Vanessa, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," she said simply. "You taught me that 12 years ago in a parking lot, in the cold, when you had every reason to walk past me and didn't." She reached into the bag she was carrying and pulled out an envelope, setting it on the workbench beside his tools. "And there's something else. I heard about Emily's deposit. I heard about what you did for Danny's mother, and I heard exactly what it cost you to do it." Marcus's hand hovered over the envelope. "I can't take this. It's not for me," Vanessa said, and for the first time since she'd walked back onto that floor, she smiled small, unguarded, 12 years overdue. "It's the $61, with 12 years of interest, and every bit of it I owed you, plus what your daughter needs to walk into that university on Monday morning with her spot secured. Consider the coat repaid. Consider the parking lot repaid. Consider every night since then that I didn't have to spend cold, alone, or invisible repaid." Marcus opened the envelope with hands that had fixed 1,000 broken things and had never once shaken doing it, and they shook now. Inside was a cashier's check for $4,000, and beneath it, folded small and soft with age, was the coat he had given away in a snowstorm 12 years earlier, the one Vanessa had never been able to throw away, kept in a box in her mother's hallway closet through every year of the life she had rebuilt from that curb. "You kept it," he said, voice breaking for the first time in 22 years of never letting anyone see him break. "I kept everything," Vanessa said. "I just didn't know until 3 days ago whose face belonged to it." Before we get to how this story ends, if it's touched you even a little, hit subscribe. because stories about kindness finding its way back around, no matter how many years it takes, are exactly what this channel exists to tell. Word moved through Camden Steel the way word always does in a place where people work with their hands and know each other's families. Quietly at first, then all at once. By the end of the week, everyone on that floor knew that the new director, the one they'd all quietly feared, was the same girl a maintenance worker had saved from the cold on a Route 9 curb over a decade earlier. And that instead of cutting jobs to protect her own numbers, she had put her career on the line to protect theirs. Danny Reyes cried again, this time from relief, when he learned his mother's hospital debt would be quietly absorbed into a new employee hardship fund Vanessa established that same month. A fund seated, at her insistence, with the salary of the consulting contract she had eliminated to save the plant. Emily Doyle walked onto her university campus that Monday morning, deposit paid, spot secured, carrying a story about her father that she would tell for the rest of her life. Not the story of the money, but the story of the choice he made before he knew where the money to replace it would come from. And Marcus Doyle kept working the floor at Camden Steel, same as always, fixing what nobody else wanted to touch, teaching the next Danny Reyes how not to lose a finger, never once mentioning to a soul what he'd once given away in a snowstorm because that had simply never been the point. The coat sat folded in his hallway closet now, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of something he'd always believed and had finally seen proven true in the most unlikely way. That you never really know, when you choose to be kind to a stranger, whose whole future you might be quietly holding in your hands. Before this story ends, if it moved you even a little, subscribe, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness always finds its way back, and tell us in the comments the biggest lesson you're taking from Marcus and Vanessa's story. Kindness is the only gift that grows larger every time it's given away, and sometimes the smallest act of it, offered to a stranger you'll never expect to see again, is the very thing that comes back one snowstorm cold morning to save your own life right back.